Now we're going to have Dr. Vicki Colvin join us. Dr. Vicki Colvin is a professor of chemistry, engineering, molecular pharmacology, physiology, and biotechnology, as well as the director for the Center of Biomedical Engineering at Brown University. Her research interests include nanomaterial synthesis, magnetic materials, biologically compatible nanomaterials, and magnetic/electrical imaging in complex environments. So without further ado, please take it away, Dr. Colvin.
Right. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Good. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. Am I the last talk of today, Diana?
No, actually, we have talks going until 7 p.m.
Oh my gosh. All right. So maybe you'll get something different out of me. So what I wanted to do today, I thought about where I was maybe at some of the ages that you all are and what questions I had. So I decided to make this sort of personal. And in the next, I guess, 20 minutes, you're going to hear about my research, but I think you're going to hear more about how I got to where I am, if that sounds like a plan. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit, maybe have some questions about the science that I'm very briefly talking about, but maybe give you some insights into some of the ways in which you can develop your career as a researcher. So with that, I guess can I share my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I will pull up my screen. And let's see. Are you seeing a title slide? Great.
Yeah.
All right, so for everyone on this slide too, you might hear me pause. So I can't see my chat, but I'm pretty interactive when I talk. So one of the hard things about Zoom PowerPoints is, of course, finding ways to interact. So I'd encourage you to jump in and ask me a question, or if I'm pausing after asking a question, don't be shy. It'll make it more fun for all of us. So let's get started with what I want to do. So I kind of have three goals for today and my time with you. I want to tell you a little bit about why I decided to become a PhD chemist, because there were a lot of decisions I made around your age and a little bit older that led me to this path. And of course, the development of the career after that. It's different for everyone who's a researcher, but I want to give you my story. You'll hear in that story what I'm passionate about and some of my research directions and how they've changed. And I'll try to highlight the critical decisions that really affected me. One thing that I remember, and it's still true of my personality, is I always stress about decisions. I wonder, am I making the right one? Am I doing the right things? So it might be interesting for me to reflect on decisions that were really important at the time. They actually did affect me, and some of the ones I was stressed out about that didn't affect me. So I'm hoping that could be useful for at least some of you. So let's get started. So this is kind of a path of my life as a chemist. And what I'm going to do is I want to start at the very beginning, which is actually a little bit younger than all of you. But I think it's important to understand how people got to where they are. Why are you interested in STEM? Why are you thinking about it? In my case, I was super lucky because when I was 6 years old, my mother was working at this facility, which is the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Berkeley, not in Berkeley, in Boulder, Colorado. So you can see this big old facility here. And in the 1960s and 70s, work here was trying to understand the nature of the ozone hole and other pollutants. It was just kind of the beginning of the chemical understanding of air pollution. So I was a 6-year-old kid. My mother was getting her master's degree in chemistry. So what you see here is one of my questions to my mom was, why is the sky blue? Does anybody know why the sky is blue? Anyone want to explain? You can hit the chat if you're a little bit shy. So it's actually scattering of light from the sun off of molecules and particles that are in our air. However, if you really take that far, as my mother explained to me, we would have a purple sky because as the wavelength of light grows very, very short, the scattering process becomes less efficient. So you get more purple light. So the real question she explained to me when I was 6 is, why isn't the sky purple? And that has to do with the absorption of water. So in any case, my mother was a very molecular thinker. She was very curious about the world. And she's still alive and spending her life teaching freshman chemistry at a community college. So she, of course, was a perfect mentor for me. And I think you'll find for a lot of folks the role of mentors, whether it's a parent or a teacher in high school, whomever, you really have to identify people to talk to about your path. So I would encourage everyone to think about who that person is in your life. They're going to become important at different stages. So my mother, I think, really was able to help me understand that there was a much deeper explanation for all of the phenomenon in our world, and in some cases really walk me through it. And so I really have a lot of gratitude for her setting me on this path. So then I was stuck trying to decide what kind of science and engineering to choose. So this is a picture of Goldilocks and sitting in the 3 chairs. So I will hazard a guess that a lot of you are like that too. You like science, you like engineering, and you're not exactly sure the area. So here's some of my observations. In biology, I was taking classes. Too much memorization. I was fascinated by the questions, but didn't really work with the way my brain worked. Math, I thought was too abstract. Engineering, that's an interesting one. I'm a professor of engineering today. But when I was your age, I was too curious about the why. So engineering seemed not as exciting to me at the time. Physics was closer, but it wasn't quite visual, and chemistry was just right. In the end, I got a dual degree in the 2 because I couldn't quite decide. But the point is that I would just make, as you're kind of thinking about the area and how you're going to tackle college, is whatever you do, don't think you love a subject because of one class. You can always get a great teacher who can draw you in. Make sure you like the subject even when the teacher is not a great match to you, even when maybe you don't like the teacher. And I think when you get into college, you will have seen enough biology and chemistry, physics, math enough times from different people. You'll be able to distinguish subjects that for whatever reason draw you in and other subjects that you're just not interested in. And it's crucial that you figure out that, answer that question yourself. And that's going to come through your exposure in courses right now, most likely. So a lot of the advising I do of freshmen and sophomore here at Brown University is sort of listening to which classes did they like, which classes didn't they like, and why. Try to take the teacher out of this equation. So lucky for me, I kind of figured out early on I liked chemistry. Biology was really what I thought I was going to do when I started school. The other thing I'll tell you is I learned also from some experiences in undergrad. I worked in the med school for one of my jobs, and I discovered I was just way too squeamish really to do biology for especially large animal work. So that was really good feedback. So I was learning about myself. Most of that happened in my late teens and early 20s, kind of when I figured out the direction. Though I still had a lot of interests, I was able to kind of narrow it down. So then at Stanford, which is where I was an undergrad, I did undergrad research, which is a super important thing to do for me, especially the career I ultimately selected. And I ended up with a double major. I stayed a little longer, partly because I like a lot of different problems. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, so this gave me some info. And what you're looking at on the right is an example of the kind of instruments I was working with. I did surface science with a young professor, and I was able to publish papers as an undergraduate. And for those of you who are thinking about STEM research careers, the most important thing from your college will be your undergrad research portfolio, not so much your grades. So it's a real shift from high school, where most of you are probably focused on your GPA, getting this very huge breadth of extracurriculars. As you get into college and you get more focused, especially PhD programs, are going to look at how well do you perform in a research environment. And what that means is I had to walk into this lab. Nobody told me what to do. I didn't have a structured plan. I had to figure out with my graduate student mentor a lot of issues about how to make this machine work, how to get data. So it's a lot more unstructured. It kind of feels like if you've ever gone hiking and you're on a trail, that's kind of like a class. I'd say research is a little bit more like being off in the woods and trying to figure out how to get to the top of the mountain, however you might wish. So it's a kind of different scene. And I loved it. I loved it so much more than being in classes. And that was also really useful information. It solidified my decision to pursue a PhD, because that's really all you do in a PhD is research. So I was super fascinated. This is a busy slide at this intersection of chemistry and physics. So when a chemist looks at materials, we're going to talk about them quickly, we see atoms that get built up into a larger crystalline structure. And so the picture on the left is a molecular version. It's telling you where the electrons are in this particular molecule. A physicist would instead take a big molecule and imagine it chopped up into little pieces. It's a different philosophical approach. And I was learning in 2 different classes one semester about actually the same materials, but with completely different points of view. So the physicists were teaching me something called the sort of periodic band potential for describing semiconductors, and the chemists were teaching me something called molecular orbital theory. And I realized after, talking to the professors and really getting into it that they were kind of the same. And so I became fascinated at how you could describe the same phenomenon, let's say the color of a material, from 2 totally different perspectives. And that was sort of my realization. I like to work at boundaries between fields. So I went to Berkeley as a graduate student, which is just up the way from Stanford. And what you're looking at is what my thesis was about, which was about nanoparticles. I think you've heard a little bit about them. So on the left is perhaps the most beautiful picture in the world to me, save that of my kids. It's a semiconductor nanocrystal. And you'll notice that it's got a lot of what look like to be atoms. They're actually columns of atoms. And they're kind of finite. They don't go on forever, like something you could hold in your hand. So the cool thing about nanomaterials is that they're big molecules. They can have thousands of atoms in them, but they're also little tiny pieces of solids. So if you're interested in this interface, you're not going to succeed in nanoscience unless you can speak both chemistry and physics. So it was really a perfect place for me to work. And it was also very new. It was a new area, very just emerging, and that appealed to me. Over on the right, you see beautiful colors. One of the first things that people knew about these, my thesis was on this, was the fact that the color of these materials didn't depend on their composition. It depended on how many atoms they had. And that was a remarkable finding, because up until this moment in human history, the only way we had to change the color of a dye molecule or a solid was to actually change what types of atoms were in it. And this was the first time we could affect that fundamental property simply by the number of atoms, not their identity. And that was super cool to me. That was just, I didn't really care what we were going to do with it. I was just fascinated by how could that be true and how do I dig in and study that. So my thesis work, so that brought me into materials. Now I'm going to skip a bunch of slides here because I'm going slower than I thought. But I will make one pitch for materials that I often do when I teach chemistry. And the reason I like to study materials, or why I got into it in grad school, not just nano, it's that I kind of was interested in changing the world. I wanted what I studied to matter. And this is a picture from a long time ago of some of the earliest humans, hunting a deer. And I always ask students to answer the question, what makes us human? I'll give you a moment to reflect. What makes us human? What makes people different than animals? You can think about that. There's some really good answers to that question. I'm going to answer it. Hopefully some of you may have thought of this, is looking at this person here holding something in their hands. What makes humans actually distinct and have allowed us to develop in remarkable ways is actually our ability to make tools. And that's going to depend on materials. So if you look at the names of the ages of people, you have the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We name the civilizations based on the types of materials people could make. So learning to make new materials is really amazing. It can actually usher in completely new types of societies. And we can, in a non-science class, argue whether that progress was always good, but nevertheless, it's transformational for our species, because with better materials, we can make new kinds of tools. And that's really at the heart, I think, of nanoscience. By manipulating materials in new ways, we're going to have new kinds of tools. Right now, every cell phone, everything we're using now depends on materials that were made 40 or 50 years ago in the silicon chips that are driving our communication systems. So nanoscience and this ability to make super small materials is kind of, I would argue, the next step. It's a really big shift in how we manipulate matter. And that's leading to a lot of changes in things we can do in many different areas, not just one. So you've seen some of this. These are the ones I'm going to skip. Nano stuff is super small. My person here is about 10 nanometers. So if it was a polio virus, it would be about the size of a basketball. So actually COVID-19 is about 100 times, about 100 nanometers across. So it's about 10 nanometers, 10 of these people. And a small protein and biomolecules are about the same size as the materials that we make. So that's something else that's cool about nanomaterials. The coolest thing about them, though, is they're really strange. I don't have time to go through this, but when you make materials really small, they often take on properties that are completely different than the bulk material. And I often describe this as micro dog becomes nano cat. So just by, for example, making really, really small gold clusters, I can create really strong catalysts that can actually absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. That's something that the ring you might wear on your finger that's gold can't do. But because it's so tiny, it's super reactive and it has those potentials. So nanomaterials are kind of bizarre in their behaviors, which is why I've been able to spend a career studying them. So graduate school at Berkeley, this is a picture looking out over the bay. Probably, I did a lot of, like, if you're thinking about graduate school, you'll do a lot of different things in grad school. You'll publish a set of papers. I'll give you one example of some of my work. We were trying to take those little nanocrystals that had size-dependent color, and this is a paper that was actually written to describe that they could be light-emitting diodes. So basically, if we manipulated them into thin films and injected current into those films, the particles glowed. And in fact, when we did that, it was sort of a curiosity. We didn't do it for any applications reason, but the reality is, down in the lower left, is that actually became the basis. I'll bet some of you have TV sets that now use that technology. So quantum dots are now used as phosphors in a lot of different TVs. It took 20 years for that to happen from the sort of early observations. But the materials, because of their small size and stability, are incredibly bright. They last a long time, and they're much better than the alternatives. So that's really what drove companies to commercialize them. So one of the cool things about graduate work is you never know where it's going to lead. And I never would have guessed at the time that it was 20 years, or I would have actually thought it would be closer in 1994. But it took about 20 years for this to develop. And it's not something I did or my professor did. It's something that a company picked up the work and the patents associated with it. So one of the other things I'll tell you about research is you're often given the opportunity to write a patent, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad for researchers. Depends on kind of where you're at and what you're trying to do. But we did write patents on this, and that was kind of interesting. I didn't make a lot of money out of it, but generally speaking, in academic environments, patents are something that the inventors get a share of. It's not always true in companies. So that's something I often tell students who are interested in commercialization or maybe business using technology. This is an example. So this was a really fundamental science paper, but it ended up sort of leading to this technology. And that really got me aware that I liked, and this was later, right? I didn't like engineering in classes, but I loved engineering in research, meaning I like to apply things. There's a really good book I'd recommend, Pasteur's Quadrant. It's an older book, but it's still very, very good. It describes Louis Pasteur and this concept that when you do research, you can just be curious about the way the world works, or you can try to apply the knowledge to solve a problem. This book argues you can do both by the selection of problems and how you approach them. So this idea of Pasteur's Quadrant is this combination between research and application, which I think has probably defined a lot of what I've done in my independent research after grad school. So I kind of learned that applied and basic research is not separate, but you can begin to bring them together. And that's probably, as I said, most of my work is right at that interface. So some other things that I did, so usually after a PhD, which the average time to PhD for most STEM fields is about 5 years, you go off and you do a postdoctoral associate, you become a fellow somewhere. You're not a prof, you're not independent. It's kind of like being a teenager, actually. You're kind of in between. And I did that at a place called Bell Laboratories. And I did something totally different. I did some more optical materials. I worked on holograms. And I'm giving some examples of companies here. If you know about the 3D goggles, actually Microsoft and Apple are sort of coming out with a sort of full view holographic projection. is sort of based on some of these early materials work about light reactive polymers. So some of that work is translated as well, which is exciting. Although at the time, the work was extremely quantitative model, right? That was pretty fundamental work, but it had this link 10 or 20 years later. A little bit about independent research, and this is going to go fast because I'm almost out of time. I would define research as the creation of new knowledge. And I hope that all of you get excited about that because it is a real privilege to be able to do it. It means that if you engage in this and develop yourself as a researcher, whatever the area, you will actually create knowledge that will change the world in important ways. And I think that that's one of the most exciting things about what we do is this concept that the knowledge that we create in the STEM fields has such broad significance, whether it's for policies, how we operate in the world, or technologies that may get generated. But it's a very creative process. It's very unpredictable. It's very risky. It doesn't always work when you're going off to do experiments. But at the end of the day, it is the act of creation. So it's something that I think a lot of times in a STEM class you don't appreciate. But once you get into a laboratory doing research, you get it. You're like, oh yeah, they don't really know what's going to happen. They might have a guess, but you have to go and figure that out. So it's a very exciting thing to do. Every everything is new. So I'll tell you a couple of the problems. So when you start as a prof, so I took an academic route, even though my postdoc was in industry. And I did that for reasons you can ask me about, but it was the right choice for me. And when you're a professor, it's kind of like your job is to study anything you want. And in fact, at the schools I've been at, Rice University and Brown University, really the research was a big part of what I did. I taught and I love to teach, but really it's the training of new researchers in my field of chemistry and engineering, and the generation of new knowledge and new capabilities. So I started off, I was fascinated by this. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. It's a morpho butterfly. And it's unusual because it's blue. Blue is a hard color in nature. Dye molecules that are blue break apart. This butterfly is blue because not of a dye, but because of diffraction. So if you were to zoom in, you would see there'd be little lines, and those lines basically reflect light at very particular wavelengths. They reflect very, very well blue light, so it appears blue to you. So it's a totally different way of manipulating color in nature. So I got very interested in this concept of diffractive materials. We did a lot of work on, in my younger years, on studying them. This is an example you can see in the background. This is a scanning electron micrograph, a lot of balls all close together. And again, I guess I do a lot of things that have color. We were manipulating color, but in different ways. So that's an example. And I chose this problem strictly based on curiosity. And like many of those questions, you find applications later. I also am passionate about the environment, and I want to improve it, and I want to protect it. So we started to do a lot of work on nanoparticles and environmental systems. And one of the things that's very interesting about nanoparticles in the environment is there's a lot of natural nanoparticles that are crucial for environmental processes. And the understanding of that requires nanoscientists to sort of make model systems and understand, okay, how does this piece of rock actually filter water moving through it? So that's another area we've operated in. We've applied those materials to water treatment, among other areas. And of course, biology, even though I found it really boring as a student, because I just didn't want to memorize things, I find it absolutely fascinating now. So we do a lot of work in biomedical engineering. This is sort of the early days. In fact, this picture I used to make fun of because it shows little nanorobots that are affecting red blood cells. And the first thing I'll tell you is if these were really nano, you probably see them like a little speck. But this is actually not my own research, but people are actually becoming amazingly good at building self-propelled nanoparticles that actually can interact with biological systems. Our work's been a little bit more focused on fundamentals. I'll give you an example, how we can image and watch physiological processes by tagging. In this case, you're looking at a worm that just ate one of those quantum dots, and you can see the gut of the worm is all lit up with the quantum dot. And through this, you can actually study some very interesting questions about how organisms manipulate and use inorganic materials. So a little bit, and I'm about to close. Last 3 years at Brown, what I've been doing, a lot of problems related to fundamentals of protein nanoparticle interactions. We do a fair bit of MRI imaging right now. It turns out nanoparticles are small enough to interact and get into the human body and a lot of different tissues, and they can be used to light up, for example, where there's a tumor, and also be used to treat those tumors. And of course, I've had an ongoing interest in water and how to both detect contaminants in water and remove them using these super small materials that have really, really high surface areas. I want to end with the last bit of my job, and this is very late, so it may not speak to all of you, but some of you. And that is whether or not you want to think about leadership and how you think about that as you develop as a scientist. So one of the things that's defined the last 10 years of my career has been a lot of roles in various administrative posts. You can think of it, principal, assistant principal of a high school, kind of like that. Still doing research, but also that. So why? Why would I do that? So what you're looking at is an atomic force microscope, one of the instruments we use a lot. And when I was a professor, very young, I wanted to use this instrument, but I couldn't get access to it. I wasn't allowed to use it at the university, which really affected me. And in fact, it made me really angry. So I used that anger, and I complained to people. And what I learned in this process of trying to change the university, so there was equal access to some of these amazing pieces of equipment for all labs and all students and all professors, was that it's very gratifying to actually make positive change in the world, whatever the scope is, whether it's your university or your classroom or your family. So I would encourage you as you develop to find ways to lead. Leadership in science and engineering is about people like it is in any area. And it's super important that scientists and engineers step up to those roles. And I would follow your passion. Usually for me, I know I'm going to take a leadership role if I'm frustrated or angry about something. That usually propels me to deal with some of these much, much more difficult problems. I mean, it's one thing to do hard science. It's tough, but boy, it's lots tougher to try to actually make change with people. So I would encourage you, though, to always keep that in mind and look for places to practice those skills and flex those muscles. So with that, I hope I've told you a little bit about research. I'm happy to talk to you more about any of it and take any questions you might have. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colvin. We're still a little bit behind schedule, so if anyone has any questions, shoot them now. Oh, someone asked in the chat, in what ways does your field compare to other forms of material science?
Great question. So nano is, I would say it's a subset of material science, also kind of a subset of chemistry. I'd say if you become a material scientist, you have usually more engineering. You think about big solids. So you, for example, would understand semiconductor manufacturing. You would have a view of almost any material. I think nanoscience is a subset of it. It's also a subset of materials chemistry. And it probably is a little bit more molecular. Often a material scientist would not be as well versed in chemistry. Most nanoscientists either have a direct chemistry background or a closely related, molecular view. So that's a good question, though. Nano is kind of embedded in a lot of things now. It's kind of like polymers. So you can think of it as a broad class of materials. Although any material can be made nano, you can make a nanopolymer, nano semiconductor, you name it.
Someone asks, could nanotechnology be used to alter genetics?
Yes, it could. I'm sure you probably today have heard a little bit about CRISPR. So one of the challenges with in vivo manipulation, so in a human, having a way to manipulate a system is a challenge. So one way you can use nanomaterials to basically deliver CRISPR editing is the nanomaterials are wrappers, smart wrappers for the machinery you need to get into a cell. So that drug delivery element of nano is you've got to make the package nano. If the package is too big or too small, it's a problem. The other, and I have a collaborator here, Chris Moore, is a neuroscientist, where it's an amazing idea, is to use light. So if you can, like, take a cell and actually shine a certain type of light on the cell, you can actually engineer that cell to turn on a very specific gene. Let's say you might want to have it make a growth factor that would, ease inflammation in the surrounding area. So that optogenetics component is actually something that's been developed. You can make light sensitive systems biologically. The problem is getting the light in. So the nanoparticles can be used to be what's called an up-converting phosphor, or a very small material that is like a little beacon that when it finds the right cell, it lights it up and those genetic pathways are turned on. So that's another example. So I'd say one is sort of just drug delivery in some sense, and then the other is really utilizing the unique optical properties of nanoparticles.
All right, there is a few more questions, but I know Dr. Colvin, you said you have to go. And we also have...
I know you're behind schedule. I'll see about getting to the chat myself and answering them. But thank you for the questions. I know Zoom PowerPoints are really difficult, so I appreciate everyone. It was really a pleasure, and good luck to all of you, and have fun. You've got it's a wonderful thing to become a researcher and to operate in STEM. So good luck. And I'll go to the chat.
Thank you so much again. Okay, awesome. Awesome. Thanks so much.